back here. Oh, I'm reading. I'm reading this, Just Matata, Since Saints and Settlers, a novel set in Goa and Kenya, and we have the author Braz Menezes here.
That's pretty good.
Great to have you
Not
here.
many people pronounce it right first time.
Well, it wasn't my first time, and I'm still not sure I got it right, and I'm not sure I'll get it right the next time. But anyway, great to have you here. Great to meet you, and you brought a few different things here today.
Yes.
Look at this thing,
That's incredible.
but not too closely.
Hold
there's-
it up
you
front.
can look at it from a number of different angles.
Yes.
You see, it's got a number of different, but it's very unusual, and we're fascinated with it, Braz. Do you want to just let us know what that is again? I mean, we know, but
I mean, we can talk about it in between, but I'll take you. What this book is all about, but let me start. You know, about a month ago, there was a book that came out about an 11-year-old boy crossing the Indian Ocean in 1950.
it's a book that came out.
Yeah, it was all over the press and things. This is Ondaatje, Michael Ondaatje's book,
Okay.
The Cat Table. And that was released, and there was about an 11-year-old boy crossing the Indian Ocean in 1950.
Okay.
Now, absolute coincidence, this is about an Indian boy crossing the Indian Ocean, but in the opposite direction. And it came out last month.
And this, now, which direction does the boy go in your book?
In my book, he goes from Africa to Goa, to India. So he's going east, the other one was coming west,
Okay. From Goa to,
from Sri Lanka to England.
did he go around the Horn or did he go up the Suez?
No, I think he went up the Suez.
Okay.
And this one went straight across. But the reason, first, Matata. Do you know what Matata is?
I don't know what it is.
Matata, for those of you who saw The Lion King, will remember it from Hakuna Matata. Hakuna means no Matata. Matata means trouble in Swahili. So this means just trouble.
Oh,
And the
just
book
trouble.
is written from the perspective of an 11-year-old who is growing up and he is watching all this, he's listening to his granddad's stories and his folks, and he's watching this strange society that he lives in, the community he lives in, which has come from Goa. They started to come in at the turn of the century. Goa was originally discovered by Vasco da Gama 500 years ago when they were all looking for spices and things. And Goa became the second most important city after Lisbon during the peak of the Portuguese. And so after 400, 500 years, the culture changed, and they're very much Indian in stock, but they're westernized. They spoke Portuguese and other languages. And at some points, the Brits had to take over and look after Goa for a while when one of the Portuguese kings took the wrong side and sided with Napoleon. And so the Brits decided this is not so good, so they took over Goa and ran it for a few years. And they discovered that the Goans really are pretty honest. They're so steeped in Catholicism, you can trust them with the cash. They're very loyal servants and things. So they started to take them to India, and from India to the colonies, which are still being established. And so I was one of that community.
So you were born in Kenya?
I was born in Kenya of parents that came from Goa
Right.
to Africa.
And we know that there's a lot of, as you mentioned, that's the story of the British
Yeah.
empire.
Yeah.
They brought Indians
Yeah,
from and all over Kenya, East Africa,
wherever.
Caribbean, all over.
Yeah. And then in Kenya, because of the background, they gave them intentionally or unintentionally jobs that were a bit more privileged. In other words, they were the number 2 and number 3 of the civil service, because this allowed the Brits, with a relatively few people at the top, to run a very large administration, which they needed. And so life went on. It was a pretty interesting experience. But the other side of the empire had its ugly side, with racial segregation and all those things. We all went to racially segregated schools till 1955
And that was in Kenya.
in Kenya. So the book's a bit about this panorama of living in different societies and different communities, because the Asian community were Catholic, partly Catholic. There were Hindus and Muslims, but all living in designated areas.
So there was a Hindu area, a Muslim area?
No, there was an Asian area.
Okay.
In fact, it wasn't even Asian. Asian is a new invention. It was all called India because India was part of the Raj and everybody was in India.
Right.
So by about the late 50s, in 1960, in fact, things fell apart. But in 1947, when India became independent, presumably everybody had sought out who was Indian and who was Pakistani, right? And
Right.
because they created this new country. But for Goa, they didn't have this problem because Goa continued Portuguese for another 10 years beyond that.
Oh, really? When did
Yeah.
it become part of India?
In 61,
Okay.
India became independent in 47.
Right.
But they couldn't call the Goans Portuguese, although they're Portuguese nationals, because then they would have to put them in a Portuguese box, which would upset their whole racial balance. So everybody brown was called Asian at that point.
Right.
It's all very complicated, but it's no different from what happens today. You know, you invent words to deal with the problem. But everybody lived happily, and it was a good life. This book is a bit about that, and it's about a culture that, because it's steeped in religion, the parents felt that they had to get their kids a Catholic education. There were no Catholic schools, and eventually there was one, but it only dealt with primary schools. So anybody who had ambitions for their kids to do better than they did would pack them off to Goa, sometimes at the age of 7, and send them across the ocean. Sometimes the mother would go 3 or 4 kids, and when the youngest was about 12, she would then come back to her spouse, who continued working in Kenya. Other times, the kids would go off and be left with grandparents or uncles or aunts, sometimes who they'd probably never met before in their lives, and be brought up by these guys till they were 25 or 30. They do the boarding school and things, because the Catholic schools in Kenya were reserved only for white Catholics. So there's a bit about this transition through all the segregation stuff, the happy moments and the things, because everybody was happy. They lived in their own little space, and because they didn't know otherwise, there was none of this discussion of equal rights and things. They led their lives within the community, and the communities really provided what today government has to provide in a sort of broader social support system. And each community looked after its own interests, after its own education, and it helped its poor and helped the destitute, and life went on. Then during the war, different things happened. The Asian community was divided roughly, with the Goans more or less allocated to the civil service and white-collar jobs. Another group went into commerce and really built up the economy. Without them, Kenya would not have had an economy. They started off with shops in remote areas where nobody would deal with. And then they built the factories and started to produce stuff and things. And another lot went into engineering and created the construction industry. Originally, a lot went out as coolies, as you know, to build the railways, just like the Chinese were brought out to Canada. But as the railways got completed, many stayed, and then they went into other jobs and became part of a broader urban infrastructure mainly. During the war years, when things got very rough in England and in Europe, a lot of the white community had problems coping because the banks wouldn't lend them money.
In Britain?
In Kenya.
In Kenya.
Well, the banks in Britain are frozen now.
Right.
So the settler community, who were very, well, they lived well, but they were also pushed and tight for cash. They had no choice except borrow from their local shopkeeper, who was usually an Indian. This guy had no other customers, so he had no choice but to give them loans. They bought everything on credit and ran a ticker, and at some point when they got cash, they paid a bit, and life went on. And they in turn borrowed from money lenders, using the same network that they had imported from India. So debt captain. There's this report somewhere in England about the role that the moneylenders and then the shopkeepers played in keeping Kenya solvent during much of the war years. And so it goes on, you know, it's so the story deals with this boy growing up and then at some point fighting and resisting this idea of sending him to boarding school. The boarding schools were of course run by Jesuits and they had their own discipline and they assumed and they boasted that you give us a child at 7 and we'll give you a man at 21 or something. But not everybody wanted or could adapt to a boarding school culture.
And the boarding schools were in Goa?
In Goa.
So they'd have to send them across the ocean for one thing and then deal with the conditions there on the other.
And part of it, of the book, is an inside look at life in boarding school. One of the interesting side trips was the stopover in the Seychelles, which is about halfway from Goa to Kenya. The Seychelles is a group of islands in the middle of nowhere, an archipelago. And for centuries, certainly from the 15th, 16th century, when they were first discovered, were used mainly by pirates to hide from each other. At one time, the Dutch were hiding from the Brits, and then the French were hiding from the Dutch, and the Brits were hiding from both sides at some stage, and eventually it moved hands from French to British. It's currently British, but it started off being French. And so that's a fascinating place with the culture of pirates and everything else. But from the eyes of an 11-year-old boy who's listening to all these things and seeing this for the first time, everything is bigger than life. The islands are absolutely the sort of stuff you design on a computer, huge, like huge granite that sort of comes out of the ocean. Perfectly turquoise, beautiful, turquoise green oceans.
I wonder if we can get some pictures of the Seychelles.
Beautiful.
I'm just making a suggestion, but please carry on. I'm already there.
Yes.
Braz. So
yeah, no, absolutely fantastic. And then out of this granite and the crevices between these huge rocks are palm trees and exotic plants, leaves that are that much, and I'm not exaggerating, 1 meter across and things, and every variety of it. And at one stage, it was considered the Garden of Eden, like lots of these places. Everybody thinks this is the Garden of Eden this time.
Right.
And there are two things that struck me there. First was the absolute splendor of it all. And then a trip around the island with a tourist person who took us around. And seeing a coco de mer for the first time. I had no idea what this was, and nobody else did.
And that's what this thing is here.
So exciting. Yeah.
It's actually, if you look at it, it's a double coconut. This one's been cleaned up. It's been sliced. The flesh has been taken out. But outside here, there's a husk. And for practical purposes, it looks like a coconut, a deformed coconut, but it's a double coconut.
Right.
And they grow on palms that are about 80 feet tall.
Wow.
And I think they flower once every, or they fertilize once every 3 years. The male of the species also is another tall tree and grows in a phallus, which is about 3 feet, 1 meter long, covered with tiny, tiny, tiny flowers while it's in bloom. And then it pollinates the female and then poof, drops off.
That's
gone.
amazing.
You know.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, but I mean, at 11, I couldn't understand all the details. The guy was explaining all this. Of course, the tourists used to buy it, and the pirates used to, and sailors used to grab these, fish them off the sea, and put them on the boat and take them to the Far East, and sell them for lots of money because it was believed that the inside of the fruit had aphrodisiac qualities.
We're looking at some pictures, by the way, of the Seychelles here.
So that's it. Yes, that's absolutely.
Yeah, we want to go there right now.
I've been
Yeah.
wanting to go for about 15 years. One day it will
Well,
happen.
Kate and William were there on their honeymoon, as you know, recently.
Oh, really?
When they disappeared and nobody knew where they were. I think that's where they were.
Awesome.
Yeah. And so we then get back and we go off to Goa. When I arrive in Goa, which again is very tropical, but actually it reminded me of the East African coast, the Mombasa and places like that, the tropical fruit, the mangoes, the coconuts and things.
And nice beaches.
Nice beaches. And the air was strong with a very powerful smell. And not a smell like the sewers or say some of these places you arrive at, but a perfumed smell. And my uncle explained that this was the cashew. You've all eaten cashew nuts, right?
Yes.
You grab a few and you chuck it, and you don't think another thought of it. But I brought you this because I think it's fascinating. I don't know if you can see this.
Absolutely.
Painting? Well, yeah, we're going to figure out how to...
We
yeah.
forget
Can we
to
zoom on
appreciate
that?
the.
I don't know. Oh, here we go.
It's upside
Braz,
down.
You might have to do
you
it
better
upside
hold
down.
it up and then he
Which
can
way around
zoom in
is-
on
Where's
it.
your camera?
Is that...
Yeah.
there we go.
Does that show you anything?
Yeah. So there we go.
Well, I'll have to see it. Now,
Yeah.
when the flowers are out,
Yeah.
they just come out a bit like the apple blossom or the cherry blossom. They come out in a full brilliance altogether,
beautiful.
and they stay on for just a short while, and then they disappear. So you get all the fragrance of that. And then, from nowhere, you have something growing, and strangely, in this case, it's the seed that starts growing first. The nut starts growing, and you see it growing, and then slowly, what is the shoot that connects the two becomes the fruit. It starts to swell, and it becomes the fruit.
Interesting.
Yeah. But when it's absolutely ripe, you get to know it's ripe because the air again smells of a different fragrance, but also a very powerful fragrance. And the fruit is taken off, the nut is separated, the fruit is squeezed immediately to get the juice out of it. And drunk fresh, it's absolutely...
What do they call it? What's the fruit
It's
called?
the cashew.
It's called a cashew apple, actually.
A cashew apple. Okay.
Yeah.
We don't get those here, do we?
No.
No, except through supermarkets, because now they're coming in here. You can
I
actually
haven't
see.
seen them here.
I've never seen
I
them.
saw a couple, but
yeah.
they came in from Ecuador or something. But this is another fruit that the Portuguese took, like the mango, from South America to Africa and then to India. And today India is exporting both the mango and the stuff. Now the nut itself, the fruit is squeezed into a juice, which is then fermented at different levels for different strength alcohol. This is the great contribution of the Jesuits to Goa. They taught them how to distill liquor. You know, if you thought it was all about saints and prayers, they brought a lot of other stuff as well. They brought the printing press.
We hear a lot of stories about the Jesuits.
Yeah.
Right.
The nuts inside this kernel, the nuts are separated by roasting them first and then opening up.
It's very hard to open it when it's raw.
Yeah. And the only thing you eat at the end, and you just do it like that, is that nut. But a labor-intensive process, and it's a part of the culture there. So these were things that all sort of creep into these stories. But the story is basically a human one of a family migration and a community migrating to a new country, taking roots, settling, adapting, and then converting.
No, it sounds like you're really painting a picture. I mean, you've taken me there just telling this story this morning.
Well,
I find myself in the middle of the Indian Ocean on a raft of some sort. How did the boy in your book get across the Indian Ocean?
He got across in a steamship. In those days, they ran the first, on his outward trip, he went out on a coal-fired steamer.
Now, did you make that trip yourself?
Yes. I did both trips, there and back.
And
But to give you an idea of what it was like compared to the little cruise ships, the big cruise ships you go on now, these would carry about 1,800 passengers, of whom about 400 would be on the first and second class.
you're talking about the steamships that you took.
Yeah, well, maybe even less, 200 maybe.
That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
1,800
Yeah.
people? Wow.
Yeah, a lot of people. But most of them were crowded on deck And deck in those ships were a painted deck with markings a bit like a car park.
Wow.
This was for the very poor. And they would be allowed a certain amount of minimum hand baggage, as it were, which they used to separate families, one from the other. And
So you had your little marked area.
yeah.
Could you set up a tent or anything?
No, I was lucky because my father was a bit more fortunate. We traveled on economy class, and then there was the first class, which nobody touched. But we walked in there, and they had these folks in their sort of spaces, parking spaces. And during the day, the women would roll up all the bedrolls. The men would get into little groups and organize card games and play poker for 10 days. The kids would run around like
Sounds
crazy.
like fun.
It was fun. It was really fun.
Sounds fun.
And then one day I get to a corner around the back there to explore with these other boys my age. And there's live goats, and they had to carry these for the Muslim population who had to eat, meat slaughtered the halal way. On the way back, we get a different boat. This time it's been converted because it was one that was requisitioned for the Royal Navy. And none of the troops were going to travel in those conditions. So for them, they had to convert these into hospital ships or other types of troop carriers. But by this stage, they had introduced double bunk steel beds. And this particular one had converted into diesel at this stage, and it was all a totally big upgrade, as they say in today's lingo.
Which trip did you like better, the first one or the second one?
The first one I enjoyed because it was so incredibly out of this world, and the second one I enjoyed because I was coming home. I had escaped from boarding school.
Oh.
I didn't even notice the ship.
Oh, yeah, right. And how long is the journey?
10 days.
10 days?
10 days.
So that sounds like,
sounds like
an
a journey,
awesome
yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
Now, what year would that have been?
1950.
And how old were you at the time?
I was 10 going out and 11 coming back, 11 and a half coming
Yeah.
back.
So this book is kind of your story in a sense, or certainly inspired by
Yeah,
it.
every first story has a personal story because you got to build on something.
Yeah.
Right.
But having started to write it, I had started to write a different story. How much time have I got? I could keep you busy here for a
Not
long
too
time.
much more time. We got a couple of more minutes,
Okay.
Braz. So
Yeah, the original story was the father coming out, two brothers, all orphans, and a girl, also orphaned by the time the eldest was 18, the youngest was 12. The girl of 12 was put into a convent because there was nobody to look after her. The eldest went to Mozambique, Portuguese Africa, where there were jobs. The second went into a seminary, but about a year before graduation or ordination, had to leave. He decided that wasn't for him, and he went to Africa. He was crossing, going to cross to Angola and then go to South America, to Brazil. But he died of malaria on the way because you walked across Africa those days. It took 3 or 4 months. It wasn't very fast. But he died. And my dad ended up in East Africa. And I was going to write these stories because it took me 50 years to then find the other family, because the two brothers brought up their families, one in Portuguese Africa and one in British Kenya. But they weren't allowed to talk to each other for all the time that Salazar was in charge because of being a dictatorship, and nobody wanted to deal with him. And so it took me 50 years. I was going to write that story, but as I started to get into the details of the other one, this became the story.
it's interesting.
And that's why I had to divide it into 3, otherwise I would never have enough time for interviews and no time for writing the whole story.
Right.
Well, it sounds like it's you're really going to be taking people on a journey with this book here.
I hope so.
And it's interesting how the book kind of finds itself, right? This
Yeah.
obviously was the book that needed to
Right,
get written.
to be written first,
right?
yeah.
So now, are you doing any book launch or any readings in public that people?
I've done a number of book launches, and there's been a very positive reaction. As I'm self-published, it's that much more difficult. You have to sell each book one at a time,
Right.
or by word of mouth, and that's happening. But that's why we're here, to help
Absolutely.
push the word out.
So I know there's some people watching, either now or in the future, that are going to be compelled to get a copy of the book, what's the best way for them to do that, Braz?
Yeah, I said you have a commercial for that, or?
Well, that's okay. You know, it's we want to get the information. So
Yes.
Yeah, well, I'm going to give you the information. I'm going to have I drafted a little announcement here.
yeah. Oh, perfect.
It says, "Hi, my name is Braz Menezes. I'm the author of Just Matata, Sin, Saints and Settlers, a novel set in Goa and Kenya in mid-20th century. If you enjoy good historic fiction that is also fun to read, join me in an armchair travel through a world of steam engines and steamers, an exotic world of romance and adventure and innocence. Just Matata is available on Amazon.com and also as an ebook on Kindle. Please email me at matatabooks@gmail.com or visit my website matatatrilogy.com.
Great. matatatrilogy.com.
Right.
Sounds great, Braz. And are you working on the next book now?
Yes, I'm working on the next book, and
Is that going to be the completion of that when you started writing, or something altogether different?
it's going to learn from this one and make sure that readers who are expecting to find out a bit more about what happened after this one are not disappointed, but also are taken into a new dimension, because the world changes continuously. And each of the books in the trilogy are set in a different time frame, all of which created by conditions outside the control of communities.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the big decisions, like here and everywhere else, are taken by people a long way away who then tell you what they've done.
That's what this whole Occupy movement's all about,
Yes.
right?
Exactly.
Do you think we're ever going to be able to turn that around and have it so that people can make the decisions that affect them?
No, I think what's important about that movement is first that it sends a message that something is very wrong with our society, which it is. You just have to look around.
Right.
And there's both a global view of where it's wrong, but it's also at the local level.
Yeah.
I mean, just look how our city is going downhill in the last couple of years with nothing but gloom and doom. And so I think, you know, it mobilizes people to say, listen, enough's enough. There are better ways of doing the same thing.
Okay. Well,
Thank you.
So
Braz, thanks for coming in today and doing this. We've got to get you back, because I know we could
yeah.
go all day on this stuff. But it's
Thank you.
Thanks for taking us on a trip across the Indian Ocean.
Yes, and
Thank you very much for the
bringing
time.
the painting of the Coco del Mar, and it just
Yeah.
kind of took us there.
Yeah.
So it's awesome.
Thank you.
Awesome. Okay.
Thanks.
So let's take a little break, and we're going to come back. Diane St. John is here all the way from Hamilton. We're going to be talking about the Canadian Unity Travel Club. We'll be right back. Thank you, Braz.
This is awesome.
3 more days you had to stay, but you never felt more far away. Out of sight and out of mind, my baby left me far behind. Now's my turn to make you see, ain't never getting no loving from me.